Swimming through the ocean. Oh, we're live. Welcome to Lobster Lads React, everyone. It is the goofiest place on the bottom of the hierarchy on this side of the internet. We are. Oh, let me see if this doesn't ruin everything. Okay, we're watching Jordan Peterson's lecture. We are exploring personality types, some more traditional teachings in the Catholic Church. Dan sent me, you can talk about it if you want, but Dan sent me a video of a traditional Catholic Church sermon, could you call it? On temperaments, the four temperaments, which are, pop quiz? No, Dan, I'm like asking you. Do you
Sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic.
Nice, good job. Nice, yeah, that's them. We knew that. Yeah. So, uh, that video is audio. There's not much interesting going on this screen in one, and then another version that we wanted to play. The audio is not up to the excellent production standards that you come to expect from Lobster Lads React. So instead, we're going straight to the man, the myth, the legend, the king himself, the top lobster of your dreams, Jordan B. Peterson. You ready for this?
Decent, you are.
All right, don't forget to tell me
Gave
when to pause.
1,000 people
Because we gotta.
a list of adjectives to describe themselves with, and one of the adjectives was happy, and another of the adjectives was social. You'd find that those who rated themselves high on happy would also rate themselves high on social, and those who rated themselves low on happy would also rate themselves low on social. And by looking at those patterns of covariation, you can determine what the essential dimensions are of human personality. One of the dimensions is roughly happiness. That's extroversion. Another dimension is neuroticism. It's a negative emotion dimension. So if you ask someone if they're anxious and they score high, say on a scale of 1 to 7, they're also likely to score high on another item that says that they're
So let me comment on that. So, I think first of all, because the church is really pulling from the Greek methodology and thought on the humors, bile, phlegm, colors, color coding, all that. And like when he says, for instance, people who ranked themselves as very happy also rank themselves as very social. So there's a corollary there. Now, according to the sanguine temperament, we would say affability is the mark of a very sanguine person. And that affability, that extroversion, that kind of seeing the better side of life and being more people oriented makes them look happier and also, in some real sense, communally, be happier. But then, of course, there are the negative drawbacks to those dispositions and temperaments. They can appear shallow. They can appear like a flitting butterfly, not really deep. And so the challenge of someone who is, allegedly by disposition or temperament or chemical makeup, right? I think in the tradition we say the matter or it's hereditary. In more modern terms, we might say the chemical makeup or the way their dopamine and serotonin receptors are tracking based on biological markers.
Neurochemistry.
Some of which is affected by diet, some of which is affected by something that you inherit, some of it's just, it seems random. But I think affability is not only a virtue. Like, for instance, is happiness a virtue? Is sociability a virtue? I don't, in the modern clinical metrics, I don't really, that concept doesn't seem to be.
Like cheerfulness might be, but happiness is like the way your emotional experience. So that can't really be a virtue. Like it doesn't, yeah. But there are characteristics, like, to be cheerful, to have a positive outlook, things like that are kind of maybe determinants of, or related to happiness, could be virtues. By the way, I just found out that when I started talking, I hadn't turned my microphone back on, so that whole part where I was talking, they didn't hear. I don't think the stream got any of that. So what I was saying was, there's an interesting difference. You heard Dan talk about the traditional Catholic concept of temperaments, and I had said right before that, which you guys couldn't hear, like, I think the way in which the methodology used in the modern psychometrics differentiates itself is to really drill down and isolate the variables, qualities of a person's personality that are the most independent of other qualities. So those are the qualities that most differentiate personalities. That's basically the methodology of the Big Five. I won't be able to, I don't think I would quite do it justice to really articulate the whole methodology of how they're doing it, but I have a general understanding of it. They like plot. They take like every conceivable possible personality trait, plot it on a 3-dimensional graph, and find the ones that are least similar to the other ones, the most unique characteristic. They'd be like the farthest away from each other. And so let's go back to Peterson talking. I won't mute myself. I think there theoretically might be an echo, but I think it's minor.
Sad, and it turns out that negative emotions clump together, and so the people who experience more of one negative emotion have a propensity to experience more of all of them. There's another dimension called agreeableness, and agreeable people are self-sacrificing, compassionate, and polite. If you're dealing with an agreeable person, they don't like conflict. They care for other people.
It seems to me like the Big Five personality traits are more similar to like the golden mean of virtues, where Like, you don't want to be too extreme in any of them, you know? Because agreeableness, I mean, well, there's virtue and vice in every. So let's say you're super high on character trait agreeables and you're super low, just the two extremes on character trait agreeableness. So a person super low on character trait agreeableness will not stand for injustice. They don't care about how many feathers they ruffle, and that could be virtuous. But they could also, in other scenarios, ruffle feathers when something's arbitrary or more tact or out of, you know, vice like pride or ego or something like that. And, you know, not just like, now super high character trait agreeableness, people get along with that, you know, they just want to get along, and sometimes you have to get along, but other times they're less likely to assert themselves when courage needs to be mustered to pursue what's right, despite, you know, ruffling some feathers. See what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I think most of what he just described would fall into the sanguine person. I mean, just as a general rule, sanguine people are a lot of the characteristics he just described. So it's obvious, you know, you're pointing out that it's not so much that they're separate systems, it's that these are kind of the hyper-scientificized,
Right.
modern distillations of
Same thing with
these
this,
more ancient approaches.
yeah, same thing with like astrology, right? Like if you removed the myth around it of having some kind of relationship to the cosmos, if you completely got rid of it, but you said there's like, you know, whatever, 13 personality archetypes, and everyone has some degree. I'm some degree Capricorn. Oh, that was a real Scorpio thing for you to do. Whatever. That would be good, but those aren't the most differentiating personality archetypes, right? Like everyone's going to exhibit some of a lot of those things. So what the personality psychology experts do is if it's a personality trait that everyone has some amount of, or more people are interested, that's not that interesting. It's not an important defining characteristic. So they want to figure out the areas in which people differ, like these variables that are most meaningful. So the same thing with the old type, and those using their personality framework is a useful mental model. It just might not be the most informative one. Like everyone has a little bit of all of the personality archetypes that they talk about, than, you know, some of these where it's more stratified on these.
Well, just to throw in something related but way too deep of the topic, from my understanding, and as you're talking about the four temperaments blend together, and you know, the ideal is to have them all perfectly blended, all the strengths and none of the weaknesses. My understanding, with a new, relatively newish, modern psychological field called internal family systems, posits that identity is not actually a single monolithic entity, but actually sub-compartment parts of your person come together to make up personality or your personhood or identity. And I think the temperaments very much fit into that type of understanding. That, you know, to be very vulgar about it, very base, you know, there's angry Daniel and headstrong Daniel, there's excited and friendly Daniel, there's sad and overly reactive / controlling reflective Daniel, and then there's I don't care, I'm avoiding, I'm not interested, disinterested Daniel. And all four of those are compartments of, or expressions of, or root function personality partitions of this whole thing that we would call identity. And so I think that would be something interesting to explore together, internal family systems. That's a whole different topic. Let's just
Never heard of it.
let's the viewers, the listeners with JB.
They're likely to put your concerns ahead of theirs. They're non-competitive and cooperative. It's a dimension where women score more highly than men on agreeableness across cultures, including those cultures where the largest steps have been taken towards producing an egalitarian social circumstance like Scandinavia. Actually, the gender differences in personality there are larger than they are anywhere else. Another trait is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is an excellent trait if you want to do well in school and in work, especially if you're a manager and administrator. I can't say we understand a lot about conscientiousness, although it reliably emerges from factor analytic studies of adjective groups across different countries. Conscientious people are diligent, industrious, and orderly. Their orderliness tilts them towards political conservatism, by the way, because it turns out that you're...
To me, the conscientiousness is one of the big five personality traits that is most clearly like just virtuous, the higher conscientiousness you have, because neuroticism is its own thing, right? So if you have high conscientiousness and low neuroticism, then you'll kind of be able to go with the flow and not be so driven doing neurotic about the diligence. But the conscientiousness you'll be able to get stuff done when it needs to get done. So that's an interesting one. And it's also interesting to consider to what extent we can control or improve these things.
Your inbuilt temperament, your inbuilt personality, which constitutes a set of filters through which you view the world, also alters the manner in which you process information and influences the way that you vote. And so you might say, and I do believe that this is true, we've been doing a lot of research on this as of late, the more accurate a measure you take of someone's political beliefs, the more you find that personality is what's predicting them.
Oh, Lord.
And I think that's a reasonable thing.
Imagine that, politics is really just gerrymandering around, personality demographics. Let's just concoct a policy platform and a way to articulate it that, cuts out this section of the population to vote for us. Forget about, and then once we're in office, we'll do whatever we want. You know what I mean? It's scary.
Yeah, but I think that would, I don't know. I think that's I don't think that's even possible. I think it's such a big thing, and I think certain people want all the votes, and I think that they try to. I think they target more things like people of low economic status. I think, the Democrat Party, right? They focus on immigrants. They focus on people
but what if that's what the policy is? But what if, for example, they know, okay, so the vast majority of people are high on openness. Open people are sympathetic to immigrants. So we are going to take a pro-immigrant stance for the purpose of capturing as much of the character trait openness field demographic as we possibly can. That's the type of shenanigans.
Yeah, I wouldn't have trouble believing that somebody somewhere is having that thought and trying to implement it.
Right.
whether or not it's a unilateral approach by some as yet unnamed cabal, hail Lobster. You know, I just want to avoid sweeping generalizations because, hail Lobster. All right, play JVP for the people. They came for JVP.
Well, it's interesting. What he's saying is, what is
I
he
do
saying?
also think there's downsides to conscientiousness, but anyway.
Yeah, talk about that.
To think about, because you have to figure out ways of simplifying the world, right? Because you just can't do everything. And so people are specialized. They have specialized niches that they occupy. You can think about them as social niches. A niche is a place where your particular skills would serve to maintain you. And so if you're extroverted, you're going to look for a social niche because you like to be around people. And if you're introverted, you're going to spend much more time on your own. And so if you're an introverted person, for example, you're going to want a job where you're not selling and where you're not surrounded by groups of people who are making social demands on you all the time because it'll wear you out. Whereas if you're extroverted, that's just exactly what you want. And so the extrovert sees the world as a place of social opportunity. And the introvert sees the world as a place to retreat from and spend time alone. And it turns out that both of those modes of being are valid. The issue, at least to some degree, is whether or not you're fortunate enough to match your temperament with the demands of the environment. And I suppose also whether you're fortunate enough.
He used the word temperament.
Oh, he used the trigger word. I had confetti.
So that you're born in an era.
I wonder what he means by temperament there.
I think it's interchangeable with personality, basically. Like, I think his inclination is to sort of like update the term rather than be using it in a more antiquated sense. You know what I mean? Like, maybe temperament is the more stable parts of personality.
Yeah, temperament is the collection of several elements they're essentially the habitual parts or the stable parts of your character that indicate how you're going to react in any given situation. Will you have a quick and explosive reaction that you get over really quickly, or will you not really show much reaction, but then it'll deeply affect you and you can go either way, negative, positive, but it's going to stick with you.
Actually,
tolerant to anyone are more quick, but anyway.
Pitch for your particular temperament, because it isn't necessarily the case that will be the case. Imagine that
he said
all of these temperamental dimensions vary because of evolutionary pressure, right? So there's a distribution of extroversion, a normal distribution. Most people are somewhere in the middle, and then as you go out towards the extremes, there are fewer and fewer people. And what that means is that on average, across large spans of time, there have been environments that match every single position on that distribution, with most of the environments matching the center, because otherwise we wouldn't have evolved that way. And so sometimes being really extroverted is going to work well for you in a minority of environments, a minority of niches, and sometimes it's just going to be a catastrophe. I suspect, for example, that if you live in a tyrannical society where any sign of personally oriented activity is likely to get you in trouble, that being extroverted and low in neuroticism wouldn't be a very good idea, because you're going to be mouthy and happy and saying a lot of things, unable to keep your thoughts to yourself, and you're going to be relatively fearless. Now, I don't know that for sure, because we haven't done the studies that precisely match temperamental proclivity to environmental demand, but you get what I mean. So, conscientious people, anyways, conscientious people are industrious and orderly. We know a little bit about orderliness. It seems to be associated, strangely enough, with disgust sensitivity, which I suppose isn't that surprising. If you take an orderly person and you put them in a messy kitchen.
That's really interesting, because I think I'm both not orderly and have a pretty high, disgust sensitivity. It's almost like I have, some kind of, contamination OCD or something. Like, I don't want my food to touch, blah, blah, blah. But I'm also, pretty comfortable with, a sustainable mess. My room's really clean right now. I wish I could show all of you. But but I have to put effort and like discipline into doing that. It's very deliberate. I can operate in like in a messy environment. Like someone who knew me really well once like was in my room, and they were like, hey, they were kind of like testing me. They were like, hey, where's that like piece of paper they knew I had, right? And I was like, oh, right here. Why? Like I knew I had a full mental map. It wasn't like the clutter was in getting in my way. I think Jordan Peterson actually talks about that at some point. Anyway. You got any ideas?
I may have, but they're all gone. Hell Lobster.
Those are nice glosses, dude.
They respond with disgust and want nothing more than to straighten it all out and organize it, clean it. And there's tremendous variability and orderliness. And as I said, orderliness predicts political conservatism. It's not the only thing, but it's certainly one of the things. The correlation between conscientiousness and grades is about 0.4. It's about 16% of the variance. It's the second best predictor of university grades after intelligence, and we'll talk about intelligence during this course too.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. The second best predictor. Ah, and it's not intelligence, right? That's really interesting. That makes perfect sense, but also it's like, right, being able to manifest the intelligence through the work. Yeah. I'm surprised that it's the second. I'm actually surprised that it's not more important than intelligence. I guess that's because a lot of people have higher conscientiousness, so that's why intelligence. Right. They have a lot. Yeah. A lot of people have pretty high conscientiousness, so that way, across the whole intelligence distribution. Yeah.
Intelligence is actually a relatively straightforward concept. I don't think I'll get into it today, but conscientious people, their industriousness and their orderliness makes them schedule their time, so they make efficient use of their time. They use schedules and that sort of thing. We haven't been able to figure out anything about the underlying biology or psychology of industriousness. We've tried really dozens and dozens of tests attempting to find.
See, so we haven't found like a underlying biological reason. So that's why I gave you some push-up for the viewers. I kind of I had earlier when Dan and I were talking about this sort of a thing, I had some pushback over characterizing it as hereditary, because it is in part hereditary, but it isn't just hereditary, so it would be incorrect to say that it's hereditary. And it's really interesting that we don't, Jordan Peterson's claiming that we don't know, and that's probably the literature at the time, but this might have been back in 2017, and you could do a lot of research in that amount of time, so it's almost like it's kind of a shame that he's like famous. I don't think there's a big incentive for him to like be being professorial anymore. You know what I mean? Like he's doing it anyway.
Well, his biblical lectures are pretty good. I think linguistically, if the speaker had said that temperament is only hereditary, that would have been error. But by saying it's merely hereditary, included in the shelf of that is the possibility that it's not fully, it's partially, and it can be changed. That's the other thing. Is as you explore it more, even though there might be biomarkers, even there might be dispositions towards, say, a particular type of comfort food or something, or a particular way of chemically reacting when your flight or flight mechanism activates.
It's all chemical reactions. So that's well, no. If you say something is this way, you're just saying it's completely that way.
But if they later say that it's changeable, that would imply that it's not as stone concrete as, well, this is just how you were born, and so this is what you are. There seems to be some some nuance to, because they do insist that as you grow in virtue and you temper your temperament can change. So what people knew you as when you were 18, by the time you're 45, they might not recognize the way, like, hey man, I always knew you, I saw you in that situation at the stoplight, and the guy I used to know would just knock a dude out. What happened? Well, here's what happened. I went through this, I went through that, I learned that, I let go of that, so like, I think you would just deserve a deeper dive into the tradition to see what these, leaders in the church have to say about it.
It's worthwhile, but it's worthwhile just like, it's worthwhile on the same level for me as it is like looking at, instead of just looking at the big five, look at Myers-Briggs, instead of just, or like look at that, what's that epigram, what's that one?
And the Enneagram, I think you're talking about.
The Enneagram.
The 9 types.
Yeah, like those kinds of things. Like, oh, this is interesting from a historical perspective. Like, how correct did the church have it, Like, how close from what you can pull out of a tradition of, like, on a long timescale horizon, as opposed to, like, using a methodology to study people, like, in modernity.
Find a laboratory measure on which industrious people.
I was just going to say, I think I'm inclined naturally to be more mistrustful of not science, but the way in which modern science is employed, particularly in the psychological fields, the character development fields, because of the insistent refusal of acknowledgement of the insistence that we're only electrical inputs is very difficult for a variety of reasons, which we can't get into now. They're way too complex.
You mean like where everything is like materially derived from our biological mechanisms? Because it's electrochemical. Neurology is more than just electrical signals.
You are
but you're
essentially a brain,
right,
in a flesh suit.
Yeah.
That is not. That's one of, I think, the excesses of science, modern science, which separates it, and people laud it and celebrate this, thinking it's a good thing, that separate it from this idea of you're a mind, a body, and a soul. You're a composite thing. You're not just biological material, electrical components. Because when you believe that, you logically then conclude, well, then with the right inputs, we could all become Superman. We could all become this thing or that thing, or maybe we should just, it just very much lends into a eugenic framework.
I'm not sure that necessarily does. I think there's more intellectual and
it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to, you're right. But it does, because of when you separate God, when you separate these traditional concepts and you restrict yourself only to the material, it then naturally tends towards, okay, well, with our human ingenuity, what's the best way to take advantage of these systems that we've built, and how can we extend our lives? How can we make ourselves more efficient? And so it just naturally tends in that post-industrial mindset of efficiency, of the haste of modern living, in, okay, let's chemically castrate here, let's chemically input here, let's modify. And I mean, the more conspiracy-minded will say they're already doing that in a negative sense in the GMOs, in the chemtrails, in the whatever. They're purposefully chemically inputting these negative things to make us all dumber, turning the frogs gay. Hail Lobster.
True. Yeah. Well, that was a lot.
Way too many topics there. Just hit him with the JBP.
Sure.
People do better, and we failed completely. And there's no animal models of industriousness either. And so I would say it's a great mystery that remains at the heart of trait psychology.
That's powerful. Wait a
And
second.
maybe it's a human's.
That's powerful. There's no animal examples of industriousness.
There's no animal models,
That's
so we also don't understand industriousness in animals. He's not saying that animals don't have the trait. He's saying we don't have in animals. These traits are sometimes like easier to understand than in humans. Like, I guess the personality of a dog is simpler than the personality of a human. That I think that's a pretty fair conclusion. So like conscientiousness, like in dogs, there's some breeds that are driven, they're working breeds. Like a border collie, people will be like, oh, I love this dog, it's like so attentive, it's so smart, and they don't realize like you need to be constantly giving that dog a high energy task to do all day long. And because it's just work, it's high, it's like my friend,
it's wired that way.
yeah. So my friend has it has like this blue healer, I think it's called, and it's high in neuroticism and and conscientiousness. Like it's like it's got this anxious energy, it's just waiting to like constantly like, what is it you want me to do? What do you want me to do? It's like hurting chair legs and like freaking out,
Specific category. I mean, you can think of sled dogs maybe of being industrious, and maybe sheepdogs and animals that work like that, but of course they'd be trained by human beings. So, but it isn't obvious that animals are industrious the same way we are. I mean, industriousness involves sacrificing the present for the future, something like that. And it seems like you have to be able to conceptualize time in order to sacrifice the present for the future. One of the things that I would recommend that you do as students in this course, and maybe in every course, speaking of industriousness, is come up with a plan of attack for the course and use a scheduler. If you treat your university career like a full-time job, you're much more likely to succeed. And if you keep up on the readings and you keep up on the essays and all of that.
Now these things can be habitualized. So I'm sure that I am more conscientious, more industrious than I was when I started college, for example. Right? Do you remember me in high school, and then me in, I don't know how much we hung out when I was still commuting to school and in our hometown. Maybe you weren't around.
I believe I was in Detroit doing media at that time.
Yeah, okay, 2010 to 2013. Yeah. So we didn't see each other much, but that was like when I really like was grinding, and still home. I kept grinding in other locations after that, and there's no way that I didn't change my personality in like a permanent way, right? Like I gotta, I like this idea of like personality's plastic. It's not liquid, it's not fluid, it's not completely stable. It has a structure, you can influence it over time, there's plasticity to it, yeah.
You're much less likely as well to fall into despair when you get too far behind, using a Google Calendar or something like that to organize a schedule for the entire semester at the beginning of the semester can be invaluable, especially if you're not very industrious, because it can keep you on track. And one of the things we know about industrious people is that they are very good at using schedules and at planning the use of their time. And so I would like to say that you should all be smarter, but I don't know how you could be smarter. We don't know anything about how to improve intelligence, and I suppose we don't really know anything about how to improve industriousness either, but I can tell you that people who are industrious come up with a strategy for solving the problem that's ahead of them, and then they do whatever they can to stick to the strategy. And so, for example, if you sat down today or tomorrow for a couple of hours, 3 hours, and you filled in a Google Calendar, whatever you happen to use, with a strategy for studying and a list of when all your assignments are due and all of that, and when you're going to sit down and study, then you won't be in a position where you have to cram for 10 hours.
Now I've done what he's talking about, which is very against my natural disposition, I guess, my temperament, whatever. And it's hard. The problem is, like, I can do all of that. The problem is following through and maintaining, the follow through of it. Whereas I think someone who has the industriousness, it's already kind of integrated into who they are, so they're kind of already there. So I think, are you muted?
No.
Oh. Yeah.
10 hours a day hopelessly right before an important exam. It's also a very ineffective way of studying, by the way. I mean, first of all, people who cram for 10 hours say they're studying for 10 hours, but they rarely are because, well, I can't study for 10 hours. I don't have the power of concentration that would enable me to do that for that prolonged period of time. I can manage about 3 hours of intense intellectual activity before I'm pretty done. And it's also the case that if you study and then sleep and then study and then sleep and then study and then sleep, you space it out, then you're much more likely to remember. It's also much more likely that you're much more likely to remember if you try to recall the material. And so highlighting and that sort of thing isn't very useful. But
I wonder if he's going to say this, but I think the best way to learn something is to know that you have to teach it. Your brain organizes information in the best way when you know you're going to have to teach it to someone else.
But reading, closing the book, summarizing.
Like, there's a saying, the best way to learn is to teach. Is that kind of where you're pulling that from? Because
Yeah, well, in medicine, like my dad would always say, learn it, do it, teach it, which is like a thing from medicine. See it, do it, teach it. Those are ways in which our culture and our has integrated the understanding that of what my claim is, but that's not what is inspiring the claim. I know that, I've read that, I've heard that somewhere. And then I had the opportunity in college. I talked one of my professors into endorsing me. So when I transferred schools, I already took economics classes, and I was a huge economics nerd. I was studying economics and finance. It was my major. And for some reason, I had to take or retake like intro to micro and macro at the school I transferred to. And I think it was just because the labeling system was, but I was like, okay, easy A's, why not, So I talked my professor into talking the head of the tutoring lab or whatever to let me tutor it while I was taking it. And I've never so effortlessly dominated a class before, in part because I had the motivation where it's like, I need to know this stuff in order to teach it to my 2Ts. So like I have to stay on top of it for someone else, right? It's for me, it's a lot of more pressure if I'm doing it for someone else's benefit, and there's that external motivation behind it for some reason. I wonder if that's a personality thing.
I do wonder why you're more driven by Taskmaster. Like you have to have that tension, that pressure, that
oh yeah, that
the impetus, the motive force to get you to do it.
Right.
I think a lot of people like that. Like, I don't think you're necessarily abnormal in that, but like for me, like I think a good corollary for me is like, if I know that I have someone depending on me or a job to get to at like 6:30 in the morning, I'm gonna get up at 5:30. But if I don't have anything to do officially that needs to be done, sleep in and
Yeah,
so
but
on.
that's a little
Yeah,
bit different than that's a little bit different than the characteristic I was trying to drill down on, where there's someone else relying, like I had this girl that I tutored, and she came right at the beginning of the semester, and she stuck with me the whole semester, and we had an hour every single week, and you know, I was I wasn't really tutoring. Anyway, I wasn't really tutoring for the money. You know what I mean? Like, I was tutoring. It was, I was learning this stuff so that I could teach it. Um, whereas like learning it for my own benefit, for me to get a grade, I don't know. And there's also like the double dipping thing. So anyway, I'm getting way off too far into this tangent. Um, when I was teaching
Abort,
when I
JBB.
was teaching it, okay, let me put it this way. When I was learning it, knowing that I would be teaching it, it was so much easier. It was just like I remembered it better. I structured the information better in my mind. And I think that's what I read about that phenomena. So I read about it, and then my experience validated the theory. So, um, and our culture, like you pointed out, those sayings. What do you call those? Idioms? Idioms?
Axioms and idioms.
Yeah.
What you've read without opening the damn book. That's useful. And the reason for that is that you're practicing remembering. And that's what you have to practice. If you're practicing memorization, you have to practice remembering. You don't just go over the thing over and over. That'll help you with recognition memory, but it won't help you with recall memory. Anyways, the last trait is openness.
The difference between recall memory and
over and over. That'll help you with recognition memory.
Recognition memory. Wow. Recognition memory and recall memory. Two different things. It's incredible.
But it won't help you with recall memory. Anyways, the last trait is openness. Openness is a creativity trait. It's also associated with intelligence, in that intelligent people, and I'm speaking technically of IQ, tend to be higher and tend to be more creative, which is hardly surprising. Creative people are more likely to be liberal politically, by the way. They like novelty, they like aesthetics, they like fiction, they like movies, they like art, they like poetry. There's something about them that grants them an aesthetic sensitivity, and that's an inbuilt trait. And it's not the case, by the way, that everyone's creative. In fact, far from it. We've used the Creative Achievement Questionnaire to measure people's creativity. I'll talk to you.
Sorry.
What is the difference?
Say it again. When he says what?
When he says inbuilt trait, what is the difference between inbuilt trait and either hereditary or bio or something that's just like...
That is the right question. So, I was wondering if our little thing was a definition of terms misunderstanding, and precision of speech failed us. So hereditary for me means a inherited trait that your parents, that your genes come down, and then you exhibit a trait that's hereditary. So your personality definitely is, to some extent, influenced by your genetic composition. But it's only to a limited extent. Now, I can't really remember what proportion they claim, how much of it is, but it's definitely, not just hereditary. Whereas my hair color, my eye color, that's straight up like genes got mixed. I either got genes or not, and I'm who I am. And my eye color is hereditary. My personality is influenced by what is hereditary. Um, but
Well,
it's
it
not
sounds
just
like we have the same
hereditary.
position. It sounds like we have the same position. I think when I gave the three options with the extreme poles, I was hoping that would serve as the framework in
In
which
which to
you
have a
would then go,
conversation. Yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah.
this, that. So
Yeah,
thank you for
so
sharing
so
it.
I
Sounds like
yeah,
we're on the same page.
I didn't want to, right, that is how the conversation went. And I didn't want, it was just, I didn't want to have to, I would have rather you just submit what you think is the most descriptive model than to start framing out like a whole I couldn't get into the conversation then, but I can get into it now, you know. Uh that it is interesting to what extent is it hereditary, to what extent is it influenced by, um, and I feel like there's some other third, like what are the options here? Inherited, environment, but I feel like there's some kind of mushy in between thing where it's like,
Mushy middle.
yeah, where it's just like a snowflake. What if your personality forms as like a snowflake? Like it's something that just, a snowflake doesn't change, it's formed, but there's not necessarily, there's so many minute, maybe your genes are like the minute preconditions that cause the snowflake, but those preconditions don't make the snowflake look the way that it does. You know what I'm saying?
That's creating the crystalline structure. And then your lived experiences outside of the womb, maybe even in the womb, this idea of playing classical music into the
Snowflakes crash
uterine
into each
fluid.
other. Well, actually, that's a misnomer. So that's that. So the classical music thing. The reason why babies are better off if their parents played classical music when they're in the womb is because parents who would play classical music in the womb would are more likely to take care of the kid. So it was like a correlation, not causal
I see what you're saying. I don't
thing.
know. I had always
But
just presumed, like, oh, that makes sense. Certain musics have more inherent
no,
order in
no, no,
them.
no,
And
nope,
by
definitely not that.
water is a well,
Definitely
have you
not that.
seen have you seen like have you seen those videos of like people playing particular tones or frequencies on speakers with sand or salt on
Yes.
them,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they shape
So this,
into the
yeah,
different
but this,
crystalline
yeah,
structures?
yeah. Go ahead. What's your point? Are you going to connect that to personality or?
Well, not so much personality per se, but in the same way that the emotive self, the affective part of our persons, is influenced by vibrations, tonalities, and sound waves. My thought was, as if you're introducing highly structured, ordered, beautiful
Oh
music
no,
into the
definitely not that.
uterus,
Oh, you're
the
doubling that. We're still on
vibrations.
that. No, it's
Well,
definitely
for
not that.
instance, we know that children can feel in utero
Right.
after 3 months, 4 months, whatever it is. So if the idea is that they're having emotionally balanced,
No, they're not
healthy
really capable of that. No,
reactions
they're not doing that kind of
to,
cognitive. Yeah.
well, how do you know that?
Uh, Science.
Like you're saying that very
Yeah.
definitively.
They're studies that the evidence is pretty clear. But
So you don't. So let's say you take a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 15, 20, 25-year old. You don't believe that the highly structured nature of certain music can actually encourage or even evoke a certain type of intelligence? What effect does music
no.
have then?
Um,
Like for instance,
I think
tribal
when your
music,
brain
pop music.
when your brain is much later in the developmental process and you're developing or exercising your audio processing and that part of your cognitive development of your mind, then you are subject to influence on qualities of your experience, such as that. That is the developmental time window where you're susceptible to that kind of influence. Definitely not during fetal development. And I think that's pretty clear now. Like,
you mean on a biological and chemical level, but I'm talking about an affective or emotional level. Because infants do feel, they feel things.
all of this is all the biological, the neurological mechanisms are what create all of personality. Like, there's no other thing going on. Yeah, so the affect of someone is like the personality is like the formation of the snowflake, right? And then the affect is how the snowflake interfaces with the world, how it might fall because it through the air because of the wind. So the personality is formed, and then the personality is creating phenomena in the environment. And the environment can influence the snowflake, right? Because like snowflakes crash together and then a little bit gets indented here and then it's also falling different. So it is influenced by its environment in a way that changes its structure also. But what I was I thought it was a more interesting, and the reason I brought up the snowflake analogy is like, maybe your genetics just says your genetics is more like you're a water molecule, or you're water in a cloud, and we're at freezing point. The genetics is like freezing will happen. But the preconditions to actually form the complexity of how the snowflake, the uniqueness, because personality is sufficiently complicated and unique that the snowflake allegory works pretty well, I think. But then your personality just forms, and so just like the crystal, the genes didn't say, oh, the crystal's gonna take a right turn here, and then we're gonna do a 45 thing, blah blah blah. Like, that's not encoded into your DNA, right? There's no way it's like, okay, let's see, let's read the DNA, and right over here in this quadrant, there's going to be a little shelf, a right angle, and over here, yeah, that's all there. Like, you can't read someone's genes and understand their personality completely. You can to some extent, and like, that's the really interesting thing. And that's what's important.
I guess at this point we just haven't found what biomarkers might indicate a certain predisposition to sociability, affability, aggression.
Well, it's not all genetic, right? So to understand how it is, or maybe I don't know. Yeah.
You about that later.
These are the right questions.
And the Creative Achievement Questionnaire takes 13 dimensions of creativity. So, writing, dancing, acting, scientific investigation, entrepreneurial activity, architectural activity, cooking. There's a handful of others, singing, etc. The sorts of things that you would assume that people could be creative about. And then it asks people to rate themselves on a scale from 1 to 10 on their level of achievement with regards to all those creative domains, with 0 being, I have no training or proficiency in this area, and 70% of people score 0 across the entire Creative Achievement Questionnaire. A tiny proportion of people are outliers, way out, and they're creative in many dimensions simultaneously and exceptionally creative. It turns out, as you'll find out, that pattern, which is called a Pareto distribution, where most people stack up at 0 and a few people are way out on the creative end, characterizes all sorts of distributions, like the distribution of money, for example, which is why 1% of the people have the old.
I've been meaning to do this for years and I've never done it. Is literally just like look into like all of the things that follow a Pareto distribution to really understand the patterns of like the world that follow a Pareto distribution. Now, Pareto efficiency is something that we talk about, significantly in my formal education, like finance and economics, because it is the best distribution to describe some phenomena that, we were studying. I think Pareto distribution, Pareto distribution is why similar businesses are grouped right next to each other geographically because of the way you slice up the demographics, like what customers are going to travel to which one. Like all car dealerships and all fast food restaurants are next to other car dealerships and fast food restaurants. I think that's described as a Pareto efficient solution to the question of where to locate those businesses. The Pareto efficient distribution is right next to each other if they're competing. But I really, statistics is really interesting. I need to study statistics more.
Overwhelming majority of the money. It's a different 1% across time. It churns. And you're much more likely to be in the 1% if you're older, logically enough, because one of the things you do as you age is you trade youth for money, if you're fortunate. I don't think the trade is really worth it, but that's the best you've got. So anyways, those particular traits, you can think of those as ways that you simplify the world, right? There's lots of different places that you can act in the world, and there's lots of different ways you can look at it and survive. That's why you can be a plumber and a lawyer and an engineer, and those all work, right? Even though they're very different modes of being. And you can have different personalities and survive as long as you're capable of finding the place where your particular filters and behavioral proclivities match the demand of the environment. And a huge part, I would say, of successful adaptation is precisely that.
What? Is that where it ends? Oh my god.
If you take people, and I told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding.
That was it. That's where it ends. That was kind of abrupt. You're muted.
It's 8 p.m., so it's kind of a good place to maybe call it.
Yeah.
No?
Sure. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this most epic episode. What are we calling these things? Lobster Lad Reacts.
There's a lobster right in front of you, damn it. Hey, lobster.
No, I meant, are they episodes? Are they gauntlets? What are they?
They are meandering sprawls.
They just are Lobster Lad Reacts. Thanks for being here. And we'll see you next